Everyone who has spent any time in technology communities over the last few years has heard the same argument repeated so many times, it has started to feel like settled fact. Linux is ready. Linux is finally good enough for everyday users. The year of the Linux desktop is either here or right around the corner, depending on which enthusiast forum you're reading on any given afternoon. And look, I have made videos on this channel that contributed to that narrative because a significant portion of it is genuinely true. Linux in 2026 is more accessible, more compatible, more performant, and more polished than it has ever been at any previous point in its history. I stand behind everything I have said about that. But there is a problem sitting in the middle of the Linux ecosystem that almost nobody in the community is talking about honestly, and the reason nobody is talking about it honestly is precisely because the people who know about it most clearly are also the people most invested in Linux succeeding. I am talking about it today because I think the people who deserve the truth most are the everyday users who are genuinely considering making the switch based on the overwhelmingly positive coverage Linux has been receiving, and who deserve a complete and accurate picture rather than a one-sided argument that leaves them unprepared for something they are going to encounter. The problem is not performance, it is not hardware compatibility, it is not software availability, it is something more fundamental than any of those things, something that affects the daily experience of using Linux in ways that accumulate over time, and that the community has developed a strong cultural habit of dismissing, minimizing, or explaining away rather than confronting directly. And by the end of this video, I want you to understand exactly what it is, why it exists, why it persists despite years of progress in every other area of the Linux experience, and what it actually means for your decision about whether Linux is the right choice for your specific situation right now. Let me set up the problem properly because it requires context to understand fully. Linux is not one thing. This is something that gets said frequently in discussions about the platform, and it is true, but the implications of it are rarely followed to their logical conclusion in conversations about whether Linux is ready for mainstream adoption. Linux is a kernel, a foundational layer of code, on top of which hundreds of different teams have built hundreds of different complete operating systems called distributions. Each distribution makes its own choices about which desktop environment to include, which default applications to ship, which package management system to use, which update cadence to follow, which hardware support to prioritize, and which philosophy to apply to every design decision that shapes the daily experience of using the system. Linux Mint makes different choices from Ubuntu. Ubuntu makes different choices from Fedora. Fedora makes different choices from Arch. Arch makes different choices from Debian. And these are not minor stylistic variations. They are deep, structural, consequential differences that affect everything from how you install software to how the system handles updates, to how hardware drivers are managed, to how long the distribution will be supported before you need to migrate to a newer version. This fragmentation is simultaneously Linux's greatest strength and its most significant unsolved problem for mainstream adoption. And the honest conversation about it requires holding both of those truths at the same time, rather than choosing the framing that supports the conclusion you already want to reach. The fragmentation is a strength because it means that Linux as an ecosystem can serve an extraordinarily diverse range of users and use cases. There is a distribution optimized for privacy. There's one optimized for gaming. There's one that runs on ancient hardware with barely any resources. There's one designed to be as familiar as possible for Windows migrants. There's one built around bleeding-edge software packages for users who want the latest version of everything immediately. The breadth of what the Linux ecosystem can accommodate is genuinely remarkable, and it exists specifically because no single company controls the platform and imposes uniform decisions on everyone using it. That diversity of options is real and valuable, but here's what that same fragmentation looks like from the perspective of an everyday user who has just decided to try Linux for the first time, based on the positive coverage they have been reading. They download a distribution. They spend time learning its specific interface, its specific package manager, its specific way of doing things. They build habits around it. They learn where settings are. They learn how software installation works in that specific environment. They join a community forum and start asking questions and getting help. And then, 6 months or a year into their Linux journey, one of several things happens. The distribution they chose announces that it is discontinuing a version they relied on, and they need to upgrade to a version with a significantly different interface and different default applications. Or they discover that a piece of software they need works perfectly on one major distribution, but has known issues on the one they chose. Or they ask for help in a community space and receive answers that assume they're using a different distribution with a different package manager and different file locations and different configuration conventions. Or they read a tutorial that was written for a different desktop environment and cannot follow it because the steps described do not correspond to anything visible on their screens. Every one of these scenarios is a direct consequence of fragmentation, and every one of them imposes a real cost on real users in the form of time, frustration, and the cognitive overhead of navigating a landscape where the ground keeps shifting in ways that have nothing to do with anything the user did or any choice they made. The Windows user, for all of Windows' very real and well-documented problems, does not encounter this particular category of friction. When a Windows user reads a tutorial, it works on their machine. When a Windows user asks for help, the person helping them is working from the same shared reference point. When a Windows user installs a piece of software, the installation process is consistent regardless of which Windows machine they are using. The consistency of Windows is something that its users take so completely for granted that they rarely think about it until they encounter an environment where it does not exist. The community response to this criticism, when it gets raised at all, tends to follow a predictable pattern that I want to address directly because I think it does a disservice to people who are genuinely trying to evaluate their options. The response is usually some version of the following. Yes, there are many distributions, but just pick a good one and stick with it, and the fragmentation does not affect you. Pick Ubuntu or Mint or Fedora, follow the beginner recommendations, and you will be fine. This advice is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. It is advice that works if everything goes smoothly, if the distribution you chose stays stable and well supported indefinitely, if the software you need works correctly on your specific choice, and if you never need to migrate to a different distribution for any reason. For many users, especially users with relatively standard computing needs, this does happen, and the fragmentation remains a theoretical concern rather than a practical one they ever encounter. But for a meaningful number of users, particularly those with slightly more specific needs, less common hardware or professional software requirements, the fragmentation eventually manifests as a real and disruptive problem rather than a hypothetical one, and being told in advance that you just need to pick the right distribution and stick with it does not prepare you for that moment when it arrives. There's a related dimension of this problem that gets even less honest discussion, which is the fragmentation of the documentation and support ecosystem. The Linux community produces an enormous volume of documentation, tutorials, guides, and answered questions across forums, wikis, video channels, and community sites. This is one of the genuine strengths of the open source community, and the depth of available knowledge for Linux is in some ways extraordinary. But that documentation is distributed across distributions, desktop environments, package managers, and time periods in a way that makes finding the specific, currently accurate, applicable to your exact configuration answer significantly more difficult than it should be for a new user trying to solve a specific problem on a specific system. A search for how to do a specific thing on Linux might return 20 results, 10 of which are for a different distribution, 5 of which are outdated by several years and reflect system behaviors that no longer apply, 3 of which assume a different desktop environment from the one you are using, and 2 of which are actually relevant and accurate for your situation. Learning to navigate this landscape efficiently is a skill that experienced Linux users develop over time and take for granted. For new users, it is a source of genuine friction that does not get acknowledged honestly in most Linux advocacy content. The hardware driver situation has improved dramatically over the last several years, and I want to acknowledge that clearly because the improvement is real and significant. The majority of common hardware works out of the box on major Linux distributions in a way that was not true 5 years ago. But the driver situation still presents specific and frustrating challenges in specific categories, particularly around certain wireless chipsets, certain NVIDIA GPU configurations, certain webcam hardware, and certain specialized peripherals like audio interfaces and drawing tablets. When these issues occur, the process of identifying the problem, finding the relevant information, and implementing a solution is often significantly more complex and more time-consuming than the equivalent process on Windows, and the complexity is a direct consequence of the fragmented landscape I have been describing. The solution for your specific hardware on your specific distribution might be completely different from the solution for the same hardware on a different distribution, and finding the right solution requires knowing enough about your specific configuration to filter the information you find to the subset that is actually applicable. I want to be honest about what I am not saying here because I think it matters for how this video is useful to you. I'm not saying Linux is bad. I'm not saying you should not use it, or should not try it, or should not make the switch. I have made my own position on Linux clear in previous videos, and it has not changed. For the right user, with the right needs and the right willingness to invest some initial learning time, Linux in 2026 is a genuinely excellent choice that delivers real advantages in performance, privacy, and user autonomy that are worth pursuing seriously. What I am saying is that the fragmentation problem is real. It affects real users in real ways, and it deserves honest acknowledgement rather than defensive dismissal when someone raises it as a concern. The practical implication of everything I have described is this. If you are considering switching to Linux, the single most important factor in determining whether your experience will be smooth or frustrating is not which distribution you choose, although that matters. It is whether your specific use case, your specific hardware, and your specific software requirements fall within the well-supported mainstream of what the Linux ecosystem handles confidently, or whether they fall into one of the edges, where fragmentation creates real complications. The way to find out is to spend time in the live session environment before committing to any installation, to research your specific hardware model and your most critical applications against the specific distribution you're considering, and to join the community around that distribution before you switch, so you have a sense of how active and how helpful the support resources are for the specific environment you are entering. None of this is difficult. It simply requires more deliberate preparation than the most enthusiastic Linux advocacy content typically suggests is necessary. The Linux community would serve its potential new users better by talking about the fragmentation problem openly and constructively, rather than treating it as an attack to be defended against. Acknowledging that the ecosystem is genuinely complex, that navigating it has a real learning curve that is different in character from the Windows learning curve, and that some users will encounter friction that more experienced users have learned to handle or avoid, is not an argument against Linux. It is honest and respectful treatment of people who are trying to make an informed decision about their computing environment. The case for Linux is strong enough to survive honest discussion of its real limitations, and the users who make the switch after being fully informed about what they are entering are the users who stay, succeed, and eventually become the community members who help the next generation of newcomers navigate the same landscape they once found unfamiliar. Subscribe for ongoing honest coverage of both the strengths and the real limitations of Linux and every other major platform, because the goal of this channel has always been to give you the information you need to make genuinely good decisions about the technology in your life, rather than to confirm whatever conclusion you were already leaning toward.